Now, for my talk, okay. For my talk, I just want to give some context, although Ollie and Attorney JJ already mentioned some. But based on the explanatory notes in the bill pending in the Senate right now, the main policy goal of the ITA really is to drive the internet economy in the Philippines and serve as a catalyst for, as I said, the surge of the internet economy, driven by the growth, hopefully, of more digital platforms and e-commerce platforms. So it's mentioned there that compared to other ASEAN countries, and I think there are several studies that could attest to this, the size of the internet economy in the Philippines is quite small. So it's still a very nascent economy. And there was one study, I think from 2018 or from last year, regarding unicorns in the ASEAN. And the Philippines, not surprisingly, has not yet registered any unicorns. And out of 8 unicorns, actually there was one from the Philippines. It was a real estate play. They received a valuation of $1 billion. However, out of the 8, 7 of them were actually platform companies. And then 6 of them had some e-commerce aspect. So that reflects the state of platforms in the Philippines. Now, just to make the bill, the Internet Transactions Act, more understandable, I would want to walk you through how it would affect digital platforms or online merchants. Like, if this bill is enacted into law, will it make the lives of merchants or platforms easier, and will it make it easier for them to go through licensing and go through the compliance process? All right. So just to give you an idea, the scope of the law covers all types of digital platforms. So it covers covers internet retail of consumer goods. It also covers online travel services such as Airbnb and other websites where you can book hotels, flights, and vacation rental spaces. And then it also covers digital media providers, including advertising, gaming, even music subscription, and video on demand. And of course, according to the bill, it would also cover ride-hailing services for personal transport, for delivery of food, as well as for delivery of merchandise. And then lastly, it also seeks to cover financial services offered through online platforms. So this would include all types of payment services, including remittances, online lending, online investments, and online insurance. So the scope of the law is really broad and basically seeks to regulate all types of businesses with an internet component. Okay, so just to clearly illustrate, let's say that I have a startup. So I pivoted from a legal career, I moved into the startup world, and I started a career delivery service. And since I'm a startup, let's call it lawyer. So we don't like vowels, so it's lawyer. We do career delivery. So we start out with parcel delivery services and eventually evolve into being able to do COD payments. Okay. Aside from that, so let's say it becomes successful, and then I expand the functionalities of my platform further and include a marketplace functionality where sellers or merchants can post goods that they want to sell and services they want to offer. And then in order to streamline everything, I also form an entity that would do retail. So I would do retail directly, aside from being just a platform. I would sell my own products, sell my own goods. So now, as a startup, what regulations would I need to think about? Will there be a centralized registry for online merchants or for digital platforms? Will there be a unitary licensing regime that I can take advantage of? Will there be a centralized manual of regulations that I could just follow? So the answer, even with the ITA, the answer is no. So the ITA does not seek to replace any existing licensing regime that's now in place under the different regulators. So you have the BSP, the DTI, the SEC, and all other government agencies. So those would still remain subsisting. And licensing and regulation would still largely depend on the activities that a platform or a merchant would want to perform. And as Ollie mentioned in his talk, there's still no universal piece of legislation that would govern all digital platforms. So for example, if you're a courier service, you would still need to get, your riders would still need to get some type of permit from the DICT. Payments would still be under BSP, etc. Okay, so what's the effect of the ITA on my business as a startup or on startups everywhere in the Philippines? As mentioned, the bill, once it becomes law, would clearly indicate qualifications before an entity may engage in e-commerce in the Philippines. So as mentioned, an entity must be licensed in the Philippines either as a sole proprietor, as a corporation, as a partnership cooperative. And if you're a foreigner, you must be licensed to do business in the Philippines. Now, I would like to clarify that this actually already exists in current regulations. If you read the Foreign Investments Act, as well as other regulations on doing business in the Philippines. I think what the law does is that it removes any doubt and any question as to whether a foreign entity without any presence in the Philippines but targets Philippine consumers, whether these entities would have to license themselves and be under the jurisdiction of Philippine regulators. So with this law in place, where it clearly states that to engage in e-commerce, you have to be licensed here, clearly, even foreign companies without any presence here would need to get a license to be able to engage business here. And then the bill also includes a provision that seeks to contribute to the main thrust of government to push for more ease of doing business in the Philippines. So the law mandates LGUs and other entities to provide some type of online registration of businesses, particularly those engaged in e-commerce. So this is in line with the ARTA. Okay. Now, I think mainly the main contribution of the law would be on how it enhances consumer protection in the Philippines. So aside from, I think it builds on the existing rules and regulations for consumer protection under the Consumer Protection Act as well as the e-commerce law. Now, there are several provisions that provides for best practices for both the platform and online merchants. So there's a pretty long provision on code of conduct or minimum provisions that all entities engaged in e-commerce must comply with. So this would include undertakings and covenants from the participants that they would comply with, for example, intellectual property rights. They should ensure that goods and services marketed and sold to Philippine consumers on their platforms are compliant with Philippine regulatory standards, including those for like health or food products, and must provide accurate information in both Filipino and English. And then there's an explicit requirement saying that the merchants and the platforms must be transparent as to costs to avoid any hidden charges. So this would include like deliveries or cancellation fees. It should all be written down. There should always be cancellation options for the consumer and a way for them to track deliveries. And again, there's an active requirement for platforms and merchants to take consumer complaints seriously and actually provide education to consumers about the risks of transacting online. And then there are also provisions on commercial communications, wherein platforms must clearly identify a message as having, as being a commercial communication and identify whether something is a promotion or something is a promotion. And if they do offer promotions and discounts, premiums, etc., then the mechanics of those activities or the terms and conditions of those promotions should be clearly specified. And then I think one of the biggest ways that this law could impact platforms is the requirements that it sets out for platforms before they can onboard merchants onto their platforms. So the law requires platforms, for example, to collect and display on the website the registration documents of all merchants participating, as well as the address and contact information of those merchants. So that will for sure add some operational costs on the side of the platform. And then one interesting provision is that an online platform must come up with a registry or a list of all its participating merchants and submit that list to the Bureau. The intention being really, I mean, if you look at all these provisions, the intention is to try and build legitimacy and trust in how platforms and merchants go about their online transactions. And hopefully, give better protection to consumers and the public in general. Okay. Aside from protecting the consumers, the law also provides some protection for online merchants themselves, as well as a chance to be more quote-unquote legitimate. So there's a provision there on how online merchants can seek remedy against other people in the supply chain in the event that the consumer files a complaint against, let's say, a product sold by the merchant. So as lawyers would know, merchants actually can already, in a way, file a claim against their supplier or the entity from whom they bought the goods. But again, this law just puts that into writing and makes it clearer. So it says that if a consumer files a complaint and then the investigation would show that the defect in the good is the fault, not of the merchant, but of the supplier, then the merchant can, in a way, minimize its liability. And another interesting thing is the e-commerce trust mark. The Bureau, under the DTI, would come up with a mechanism wherein they would issue trust marks that websites or platforms, including merchants, could use and display in their own marketplaces. And then that would prove that that particular merchant is compliant or demonstrates efforts to comply with the code of conduct provided under the law. Okay, so that's basically the effect of the ITA. And then, so where do we stand now? So clearly, the ITA is more of a consumer protection piece of legislation. It does not affect any existing licensing regime for different types of online platforms. And then the regulation at the end of the day would still depend on the activities conducted by each particular entity, whether you be a platform or a merchant. So as mentioned, this is just a run through of all the possible regulations that a platform or a merchant might be subject to. So for couriers or services, you have the DICT, that's the regulator for all parcel delivery services. So what's regulated here actually are the riders and the people doing the deliveries. They need to get a permit. And then if you're a ride-sharing application, let's say you're Grab, you're a driver, or you're the owner of the network operating that system, you need to get a license and authority from the LTFRB under the DOTR. And if you're a three-wheeled vehicle, like your tricycle, you'll fall under the LGU. The reason I included that here is because there was a time, maybe several months, where I think until now, where there's some sort of regulatory confusion as to where motorcycle taxis would fall under. There was this one, so let's say you're a motorcycle taxi back in 2017 and then you wanted to get a license. The most obvious thing for you to do is to go to the LTFRB and get a license to be a PNVS. However, if you go to the LTFRB back then, they would tell you that they can only regulate four-wheeled vehicles. You need to go to the LGU. Then when you go to the LGU, they'll tell you that they can only regulate three-wheeled vehicles. So parang, that's I guess, typical experience of an entity in an area that does not fall under your traditional boxes for regulation. And then, ayan. And then if your courier service has some sort of payment service, like let's say you do COD, you may also fall under the regulatory jurisdiction of the BSP. So yon. Anytime your activity or whatever type of business you are would include some sort of payment service or movement of funds, most likely you'd fall under the BSP and you will need to get some sort of license or registration. So for example, if you do payments, you need to register as an operator of payment system. So that's just an online registration with the BSP. And even if you're just a tech provider, let's say you just provide information, you're not really the entity handling the money, you'll still be an OPS for the BSP. And then if you do more complicated money service business, then you can either be you may either be required to get a remittance license or forex, e-money, etc. And then of course, if you develop a closed loop system for payments, let's say gift cards on an app or through the use of cards, then you may also fall under the jurisdiction of the DTI if that's a gift check. Okay. Now for consumer protection, just to clarify, the ITA does not seek to replace all existing consumer protection regulations. It just adds another layer of protection. These pieces of legislation would continue to exist and would be applicable depending on the type of transaction that's involved. So generally, the Consumer Act of the Philippines, the E-Commerce Act, and the Cybercrime Prevention Act would apply if the transaction involves digital transactions. And then for data protection naman, if you process data, if you process personal information, then the Data Privacy Act would apply. There are more special laws if you're handling more sensitive types of data. Let's say if it's health, then various special laws would apply. If you're handling payment data or financial data and you're under the jurisdiction of the BSP, you may need to comply with the BSP security standards as well as consumer protection standards. Okay, so that's where we are. Now back to my previous example, as I said, like I have a startup. What if, so my business, I managed to grow the business, I managed to get a lot of users, get a lot of traction. And then the next step na is fundraising. I want to expand my operations, upgrade my current systems. So I'm looking at getting foreign investors. Okay, so Lawyer, the startup, is a wholly owned Filipino entity. But now I'm looking at foreign investors. Will I be able to issue them equity or get funds from them? Okay, so in summary, the answer would be that may be problematic. I may need to maintain my status as a wholly owned Filipino entity because of the existing regulations on mass media and retail. So under our existing regulations, all platforms or any entity that does or that communicates ideas to the public, whether it be through newspapers, radio, or the internet, may be deemed as a mass media entity. So the definition is very broad. And the SEC has issued repeated opinions stating that digital businesses that display information pertaining to third parties, like third-party products, third-party goods, are in fact mass media. Although recently, last year, the SEC provided a clarification or provided certain guidelines which a platform should comply with in order to avoid being deemed as mass media. So they said if you're just listing the available services on your platform, so let's say you're just listing the goods that people can buy on your platforms, you're not actively marketing them, you're not displaying promotional materials, then you're not mass media. So this particular standard may be problematic and may be difficult for digital platforms to follow, since if you follow this, it would be difficult for you to come up with a user interface that would grab the attention of your intended market. And then it would also be problematic in terms of earning or maximizing revenue, since it would prevent you from publishing ads and hosting paid content. So that's mass media. That's one thing we need to deal with. But another issue would be retail. As I said, I would be conducting retail on the platform as a direct retailer. And if you look at the law, retail is liberalized, meaning foreigners can participate. A retail entity can be 100% foreign owned, subject to certain requirements. So I've listed here the three main requirements for foreigners to participate. It all has to do with number one, capitalization requirement, which is 2.5 M, history of retailing, so a 5-year track record in retailing, and the foreigner must have 5 retailing branches, like physical branches. And then the foreign retailers' home jurisdictions allow the entry of Filipino retailers. Now, if you go through that list, it's impossible for digital retailers to tick all of those boxes because of the requirement for the 5-year track record for retailing and the requirement for physical branches. Now, digital retailers would have no way of complying with that. So conclusion is, I can't raise from foreign investors. Now, that's where we are. Before my last slide, I just want to show you this. This is a survey conducted by Kubo Philippines, PwC, MAP, and Idea Space, involving founders and investors in the Philippines. So, as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, the main goal of the law really is to drive the internet economy in the Philippines and encourage more digital platforms. In this survey, founders were asked what the challenges they faced were when they were starting their business. And obviously, the number one would be capital requirements, so funding. But the second issue was regulatory requirements. So those two are still the main hurdles that founders are trying to solve. And it's not really access to the relevant networks or market readiness. The main concern is still regulatory requirements. And then same thing, investors naman, they were asked what they thought were preventing startups from being disruptive. So similar din siya. Number one is financial resources. Number two, the regulatory factors that startups have to deal with in the Philippines. So yun. So to conclude, what's our takeaway? So the ITA, the bill, once it's enacted into law, it's just one factor that e-commerce platforms and merchants need to consider when doing business in the Philippines. And the good thing is, the positive is that it definitely enhances protection for consumers, and by instituting minimum codes of conduct, etc. And hopefully it contributes to the ease of doing business for merchants because of that online registration thing. However, we also need to look at how it would impact the desirability of the Philippines as a hub for regional e-commerce platforms and other types of platforms. So there. Thank you.